So my first question would be, how did the reconciliation process in your point of view function, and what role did external factors have, especially the European Union?
Well, I would say that, I mean, the main emphasis in reconciliation in the first decades has been really the ICTY, and that is part of the strength and the weakness of that approach. I think the strength is that there was a court which has had the resources to really take care of a number of key cases, and whatever one thinks of the verdicts, not all of them are satisfactory, not all of them are ideal, but overall it documented to a great degree the crimes. That was very important. Now, the problem of that also has been that this was an externally driven process, and a lot of colleagues, other scholars have documented very well how the court didn't really penetrate social perceptions in many of the countries, and in fact was manipulated in its judgments, the public discourse and the interpretation, which has made it very hard to really shape public perception about the wars of the 1990s. And so this in a certain way was the problem of an externally driven process, which might have been the only one possible at that time. I think external actors, including the European Union, have never really put enough emphasis on other processes, or they did so only belatedly. I mean, of course, there have been other initiatives, plenty of them, from RECOM to lots of national initiatives to deal with the past, from the Youth Initiative for Human Rights and other NGOs which have been documenting, but also trying to seek to have some dialogue on that. I mean, there was historians dialogue, there were the textbook initiative, for example. So there have been multiple initiatives, although they've received generally relatively limited support from the outside. In the first decades, it was often seen that they would be competing with the ICTY, and there was a worry that you shouldn't support anything which might sabotage the ICTY. But on the other side, after the ICTY is closed, or has been basically just the kind of leftover mechanisms in place, there isn't much else in place. And I think this is really the problem, is that reconciliation, I mean, it's always a big word which is thrown around, but it's usually, reconciliation in my mind is the end of a long process. You can't induce reconciliation from the outside, but what you can support is initial processes which might then eventually lead to reconciliation. And often the discussion has been, we need reconciliation, which is kind of taking the story from the end rather than from the beginning. So support for critical dealings with the past, challenging nationalist myths, and all of that has not been done sufficiently. And so today, unfortunately, we see a position where the narratives about the 1990s are not that different from where they were 25 years ago. And that is quite painful, because much of the progress in the region, which existed at least tentatively in the 2000s, has been undone when it comes to talking about that period.
You mentioned self-criticism and nationalism and the role they play in the reconciliation process. And how they actually influence the reconciliation process. So how would you comment on the politics and their influence in the reconciliation process, which happens every day in the Western Balkans? And especially a bit to comment maybe also on the media, because we know that the media plays a huge role in the Western Balkans, and that many leaders and many leading politicians in the Western Balkans have their own media, which they represent to the public then.
I mean, first of all, I think you've had some politicians in the past who've made some gestures of conciliation or approaching each other. I mean, I'm thinking of Ivo Josipovic in Croatia and his relationship with Boris Tadic. There have been gestures, but overall, very few politicians have been really willing to self-critically examine their own, in a certain way, as I said, their own demons, their own crimes. It's always easier to say the other side committed crimes, or the own wars were defensive or just. And, this is, of course, there's a difference between the parties to the wars. Not all are equal, but there hasn't been a critical self-examination, a critical, kind of coming to terms of saying, we had war criminals, we had criminal war aims. These were not just accidents, they were part of the war strategy. Most sides, there were at least these strategic commitment to engage in ethnic cleansing and expulsion of people who are different. And that, is partly due to the fact that some of the politicians in the region are still the same elites from the 1990s. I mean, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić was a politician in the governments which were in power when they attempted to ethnically cleanse Kosovo, and the party which was committed to ethnic cleansing and murder in terms of its programmatic orientation. And we also have other politicians in the region, maybe less involved during the wars, but they're parties which were very much supportive of the respective nationalist narratives. And then other politicians who are not very courageous or worry that they will lose voters. So all of that, and egged on by media often, which is uncritical, which seems to sell by promoting nationalist narratives, creates an environment where at least it's often very difficult to offer a different take. So if you're criticizing Operation Oluja in Croatia, talking critically about the fact that that operation also included war crimes, you're often considered to be a traitor or in a certain way anti-Croat to promote that. In Serbia, if you're trying to acknowledge that Serbs committed war crimes in Kosovo, engaged in a mass murder of Albanians, that is often denounced as ignoring NATO bombing. Or in Kosovo, if you are talking about war crimes with Čeka, it's often seen as being pro-Serbian. And if you're talking about the crimes committed by the Mujahideen or other units in the Bosnian army, then it's often seen as being, against the Bosnian, in Bosniak community. Again, all of these narratives have very little space. And that is, I think, really the problem we're having, and political elites don't see any benefit in being self-critical.
Thank you. How do you see the readiness of the leaders and of the people in the Western Balkans to contribute to reconciliation?
Well, I think leaders, again, have not seen much interest. And I think partly, the very fact that reconciliation, or at least dealing with the past, has often been linked with external actors, with EU integration and so on, has often made elites think about it in a very instrumental way. So even when it came to ICTY cooperation, it was very much based on the logic of we cooperate with the ICTY because it benefits us economically or politically, but not because we're committed to dealing with the crimes of the past. So this has resulted in a situation where dealing with the past is often associated with an external process, which you do because you have to do it, not because you think it's the right thing to do. And that has, in a certain way, hampered the process. I think citizens, again, have I think there are these very mixed signals. On one side, I think experience suggests that there's a plenty of cooperation, plenty of joint life of people from different backgrounds across the region. Sometimes not talking about the past, so it's you make the past a taboo to talk about everything else, which is easy to talk about because culturally, music, traditions, lifestyles are shared, so it's easy to find a common language. But of course, that means that often the difficult and sensitive parts are just, in a certain way, put aside, which is maybe pragmatically a wise thing to do, but I think down the road is risky because it means that the past is not dealt with. And, while it's not exactly the same as we had in the socialist Yugoslavia, also there we had no open critical debate about the past of the Second World War, but a very one-sided ideological interpretation, which meant that basically also there, it opened space in the late 80s, early 90s to nationalist narratives, which had not been effectively discussed and challenged. And now we're seeing a similar kind of dominant narrative, which is very hard. If people don't talk about it, then it's in a certain way swept under the carpet and not dealt with. And I think this is though the primary responsibility of political elites, who are, of course, at the end of the day, chosen in elections, usually not because of their way they talk about the past, but for other reasons. But I think that kind of jointly leads to a situation where there is lots of joint life and lots of, reconstruction of joint life, even though, of course, people have less opportunities to meet than they did before, but no real kind of discussion about what happened in the 1990s.
Thank you. How important is regional economic cooperation for reconciliation, especially considering the relations between the EU, China, Russia, and Turkey, who all have influence in the Western Balkans? How do you comment on that? Well,
closer economic and political ties help communication among people, at least in theory. And so certainly, trade and mobility are things which help to bring people together. So absolutely no doubt about it. But at the same time, it also doesn't automatically trigger it. So yes, of course, if you can travel more easily from Pristina to Belgrade or from Sarajevo to Zagreb, if you trade more, that might facilitate reconciliation. But I think these are separate processes. You can have lots of economic ties and still have deep political disagreements and also tensions. It also, of course, the logic is the deeper the ties, the harder it is then to rupture them and to destroy them. But, think about Yugoslavia, which had lots of economic ties and factories which were integrated and economic relations which were very deep, and still it could be destroyed. So economic ties are no guarantee against their political destruction by those who want to destroy it and who don't care about the costs of destroying it. So I don't think that's any, we can't, it's no insurance policy. There's nothing wrong with it. It's good. And I think one can't oppose it, but I don't think it is a substitute for a political and societal process. Now, when it comes to the role of other external actors, that's a very complicated story, which I think is less connected with regional cooperation and more with kind of geopolitical economic competition. And again, some of that engagement might make regional cooperation and reconciliation more difficult, because some of these external actors might be seen as supporting one side, quote unquote, rather than another. But in other cases, it might, in fact, help regional communication. So, building new train links or roads certainly can help. And if that is a Russian, Chinese, or European road, has maybe environmental reasons, but not so much, an impact on reconciliation.
How would you comment on the mini Schengen and the initiative which was made, especially also by the Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić? Is this a big step towards reconciliation, or is it maybe a setback?
Well, I think it's neither. I think the mini Schengen, the idea of having, a regional integration is nothing new. It's been on the cards for 20 years. All the different forms of regional cooperation, back to the Stability Pact and the Regional Cooperation Council, and multiple commitments have always been going in the direction of close regional economic cooperation. think of the CEFTA, the Central European Free Trade Agreement, which was originally Central European and is now basically a Balkan economic free trade agreement. If that was all implemented, then you would have a mini Schengen already. So in that sense, it's basically repackaging an old idea. So in that sense, closer economic and political cooperation among the countries in the region is a good thing. There's no doubt about it. But is it a substitute for either EU integration? No. Is it a substitute for reconciliation? Neither. It doesn't make it easier. Of course, you can say closer trade links between Albanians, from Albania and Serbia. It has all kinds of benefits, and certainly there is the more people get to know each other, and there's plenty of evidence for that. The more that people get to know each other, the less prejudice they might have. So this can certainly help. But again, if this is at the same time coupled with hate speech in the media and antagonistic discourse, often by the same media who are controlled by the politicians who support mini Schengen, then they're kind of working on two parallel tracks. I'm thinking of Vučić, who promotes mini Schengen and says we need to cooperate in the region, and at the same time, his most loyal media talk about Shqiptari, the derogatory term for Albanians, or Balija for Bosniaks, or an Ustaša for Croats, on a nearly everyday basis. And so in a certain way, you're pulling down the bridges you're building during the day at night with this kind of rhetoric. So I'm just not sure how much the daytime building of mini Schengen is really helped by the nighttime destruction by those media.
What can we expect from the future? Especially, what can one expect more? Can one expect more contribution to reconciliation from the local politicians, or not?
Well, to some degree, I think reconciliation basically, I think, is first and foremost a step where you need politicians and social elites who are willing to critically self-examine their own history and past. And that, those will come through elections. I mean, I think these are probably politicians who won't be elected on that ticket because that's not a very popular one. But if you have politicians who are, first of all, themselves not burdened by the past, who have no, in a sort of more personal stake in a particular narrative, and who are otherwise, let's say, progressive in the sense that they want to move out of kind of the straitjacket of certain nationalist narratives, and they, seek, let's say, integration into Europe in not just in the terms of EU accession as technical, but also as a normative process, then this would be part of that re-examination. And I mean, of course, my hope is that that's a matter of generation, and then that this will happen. And of course, there are political actors across the region who have been promoting a critical reflection on one's own past. And, if you think about also these kind of parties which are, breaking with established patterns, whether it is parties like Možemo in Croatia or Naša Stranka in Bosnia and Herzegovina, or other social movements who are all in a certain way often multi-ethnic, which are often critical of nationalist narratives. They are there. They're often not politically as powerful as they could be, but I think they are those actors, and and I think they might be successful in circumstances down the road, not to do so much with the past or dealing with the past, but if they would to gain a position of power, they probably would also think about and talk about that period very differerly, and that would open the door for a more critical self-reflection. And one can hope that younger people who, again, have no personal burden, who are not involved in war crimes or supporting nationalist options, can more innocently and more easily deal with this period, because it's not their guilt or responsibility or burden, and that might make it easier down the road.
Last but not least, does the pact impact the now? And did the people and the politicians overcome the past? If not, will they?
Well, I think the problem is that the past is still present, in a sense that the past has relevant repercussions for today. In some cases, it makes real political sense, so to speak. I mean, because as long as Bosnia's, for example, Herzegovina's internal organization is contested, politicians in the Republika Srpska will use a particular narrative to justify the existence of Republika Srpska and maximum autonomy. Similarly, in regard to relations between Serbia and Kosovo, how you interpret the war of the 1990s matters a lot, whether Serbia has a claim to Kosovo or not. So in that sense, I think that's the difficulty. The past has real life political repercussions. And then the other way in which it is important is that it's being, munitionized. It's used as ammunition in real political battles. So you have the political right in Croatia, which often claims the political left in Croatia are anti-Croat because they didn't support the Croatian state in the 1990s. I mean, this is not a true claim, but it's also one which is used to discredit political opponents. And I think this is one of the difficulties we're also seeing, is that there is the kind of real open political questions where the past is used, and then there is the kind of instrumentalization of the past. And as long as that gets votes, as long as you can win elections with that ticket, that is of course gonna make it very hard to deal with it, because it's not just an issue about how painful is it to talk about the past, but if you're worried that you're not going to get elected, then that's going to make it much harder. But again, I think that might be a matter of time. But unfortunately, the wars of the 90s never really ended in that sense, because many of those disputes, remained open. So we don't have this break, this year zero, where everything started new, and then then the 90s were just a question of the past, but they are very much still a question of the present, and that makes it so much harder to have that moment of rupture, which allows you to kind of look back more critically and with some degree of distance.